Welcome to this edition of the No Delusion Zone. Maria Popova is Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. Oxana Shevel is Associate Professor of Political Science at Tufts University in Massachusetts. They are co-authors of a new book titled Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, Diverging States. And I want to read just one review of the book that I believe best summarizes the way that I feel. And I quote, "If you have only one book to read on the origins of contemporary conflicts between Russia and Ukraine, this is the book. The perfect team of Popova and Shevel together bring unique depth of understanding to both countries to explain this tragic story of divergence between Ukraine and Russia. It will become the definitive account of this history by which all future studies will be judged." And that was Michael McFowle, former US ambassador to Russia. Maria and Oksana, welcome to the No Delusion Zone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very good to be here.
First, I must say that I agree with that review very much, which is why I read it. And I was saying off air before we started that I have read a lot of books on the history of Russia and Ukraine and what may have caused the current conflict. And yours was not only the easiest to read, which being university professors is not always the easiest thing to write for a general audience, I realize, but it was an easy read. And in my opinion, you provided the most relevant facts in trying to understand this history and piece it all together. So let me begin by asking a most obvious question, I think. Why did you write this book?
That's a really good question that we've gotten a lot. And people usually ask whether we started writing this before the full-scale invasion in 22, but really before the 22 invasion, in the run-up to it, we were writing short pieces for a broad audience, trying to explain where things we thought were going, trying to warn people that there will be severe resistance from Ukraine if Russia were to attack. And so when the war did start, that's when we thought, okay, this will require, there's so many misconceptions out there about what led to the war. There's so many people who were surprised by Ukraine's resistance. So this will require a full-length book for us to explain why we got to this point and how we got to this point. So we wrote it right after the full-scale invasion started.
Okay, thank you. Again, as I said before we started recording, I've actually visited both Ukraine and Russia many times in the past prior to 2014. And while in Russia, I was always amazed and to be honest, a little uncomfortable at the condescending remarks made about Ukraine and Ukrainians, terms that I won't repeat here. But one of the terms, which is one of the more benign terms, referring to Ukraine as Little Russia, although not really demeaning, was an example of what I believe is an ingrained idea within almost all Russians of Ukraine as a vassal state, an inferior culture. And your book opens with the February 21st, 2022 speech by Putin, in which he claims, among many other incredible statements, that essentially Ukraine does not exist as a true state, and that it's only the creation of Russia, both pre and post-Soviet Russia. Can you, either one, walk us through both that speech a little bit and its significance for all that came afterwards, and then perhaps, if you could, segue into the next section of your book where you actually set Vova straight on the true history of the Rus and their relationship to modern Russia and Ukraine. By the way, is it true, I have to ask this, that the phrase Kievan Rus was never really mentioned in most historical records until, well, fairly recency, I think, what, the 18th or 19th century?
Yes, so this vignette that you tell, or the impression that you got in Russia, how many Russians, both in the general public and certainly Putin and his entourage, kind of didn't consider Ukraine "quote unquote" a real country, right? And that's really central to the argument we make in the book, because this is exactly one of the ways in which Ukraine and Russia have diverged since 1991, which ultimately contributed, or was one of the root causes of the actual war. Is that Ukrainian society have evolved and got more and more committed, both society and the ruling elite, to independence, to sovereign statehood, and distinct Ukrainian identity solidified over these 30 years. And of course, when we go in history, we talk about how this push for Ukrainian kind of separateness, for autonomy in different forms and shapes, does have historical also precedents. But the story after 91, that's sort of the center of our book, is very important. And in Russia, unfortunately, there was no understanding of this, or rather there was resistance to it. And sort of this, I think in the book we may have used the term delusion about Ukraine that the Russian society and the ruling class shared. So this notion that these Ukrainians are not really separate people, they're really little Russians, they're sort of like us, and they can't really do anything by themselves that would be different from what we would do, what we would want. So this is also what we call an imperial lens at looking at Ukraine. So when, for example, these processes began and intensified in Ukraine, we'll probably get to talk about it later, certain things we discuss in the book. For example, the strengthened democratic competition, especially after the Orange Revolution in 2004, stronger sense of Ukrainian identity that is again manifested in a variety of polls. There was dismissal of these things in Russia. They were either seen as somehow not real, that again, sort of fake preferences, fake news, people are not really saying, what they really feel. Or it was some sort of form of Western meddling. So again, these outcomes or processes were happening in Ukraine that Russia did not like, was somehow not the result of authentic domestic political developments in a complex society, admittedly, but some sort of, evil hand of the West. And therefore, right, I think we think that part of the rationale, and this is where the speech comes in, when Putin calls on Ukrainian armed forces to lay down their arms, when they send relatively small army, when they go straight for Kyiv, they they hoped that once Russian troops rolled in, that many of these Ukrainians who are really in the heart of hearts are Russians would welcome the occupation. And then it's true, you don't need to occupy, right? You can install some sort of Russia puppet government and everything will be fine. I mean, Putin says in his speech they don't plan to occupy Ukraine. And that's exactly, these processes that, again, we go at length in the book that really contributed to this fundamental misunderstanding on the part of Russian elite in particular, what Ukrainian society has become. So that's, that's something that's important. And then if we go deep in history, I mean, neither of us is a historian, so the history chapter that we wrote, we relied on the research of our colleagues who are historians, and we sort of read a lot and tried to synthesize it in a way that would be both succinct and accurate with the facts. And it is indeed true that what historians note that this whole notion that Putin now is very wedded to, that somehow Russian history starts in Kyiv and Kyiv is really Russian, there was this Kyiv and Rus, and then that is relatively late construction. So Ukraine and Russia, after the Mongol invasion, were separated, the territories of today's Ukraine and Russia, for more than 300 years. A lot of things happened, elite in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, ancestors of today's Ukraine, they were very different. They had different sort of political ideas. They had different societal structure. And then when they signed this military union in the 17th century, and then later Ukrainian territories come under the control of the Russian Empire, this mythology is developed. In part, sort of ironically, historians note, some of the Ukrainian elites at the time kind of wanted to raise their own position in the empire, to narrate the story that there was this always kind of continuity, right? And then now we have this. But this is really quite late construct. So, and the whole notion, as scholars of political science, of comparative politics, we know that this whole idea that there are authentic and fake nations is just anti-scientific. It's just not how social and political life developed around the world. People thought of themselves in different categories. They didn't really think of themselves in national categories. So in that sense, we can say Kyiv and Rus was neither Ukrainian nor Russian state in contemporary terms. But that, of course, is completely lost on Putin when he tries to have this very essentialist narrative that people who lived there were always Russian, and then there was all this meddling by hostile Western powers or evil nationalists who would try to separate these countries. and now we're trying to correct the historical wrong. So that's not how the world works, that's not how history works, and that's certainly not how Ukrainian people think of themselves and their nation.
Well, yeah, I mean, just to follow up on that, and again, I've been reading a lot about this specific topic recently, and it's only within the last couple hundred years or so, 200 or 300 years, that the idea of nations in Europe have really come about. In the 18th and 1900s, before is just like you said, they didn't think of themselves in terms of nationality. And so for Putin to say that there was never a Ukrainian state, of course, is nonsense. But what else is new? And I think also that the Cossacks might have a little different view of what who is Ukraine and if they ever had a Ukrainian culture before that. But it seems to me, and this is just me, that Putin and most Russians may actually have it backwards regarding the origin of Russia coming directly from the Rus. If anything, to me, Russia is a construct of Ukraine. And in fact, it might be called the Bolshoi Ukraine because it's bigger, but it actually came out of a prior civilization that they are now usurping. But I guess that leads me to another related question. Why do you believe that the West, including the United States, of course, has always had a Russian-centric view of history?
Should I? Okay, maybe I'll start and Maria will join. I think one of the important reasons for it is that there wasn't actually in history a viable long-term functioning Ukrainian state that would be telling a history of the state and the nation with the power of the state behind it. I think that's very important. Like, who was telling the history of this land, right? If Ukrainians were, for most of their history, a stateless nation, and attempts, certainly after 17th century, and then attempts to establish separate statehood, say in the 20th century, were very short-lived and crushed by the Bolsheviks after the Bolshevik Revolution. And then the history of Ukraine and Ukrainians was told by these other powers that were interested, right, in narrating a certain type of history about these lands, how, say, Ukrainians and Russians being in one state is a natural order of things. It was not the result of, if you take 20th century, of mass violence, of, genocidal policies of the famine, of subjugation of opposition, all of these things. So the story of Ukraine as having an agency, as having its own history, as having its own complexities, was not, the kind of story that was told by the powers that had the audience of both scholars, and Western audiences, right? And that's why we have, senior President Bush on the eve of Ukrainian independence declaration in summer of 1991, giving this infamous chicken Kiev speech when he warns against Ukraine separating from Russia, because again, it was sort of understanding of what is behind these processes was probably at the time still quite limited, or certainly not as, full as it is now. And then, there were obviously other sort of concerns that nuclear weapons might get spread out and so forth. But I think the absence of Ukrainian state, at least in my opinion, I think this is one of the important reasons why the history of Ukraine was narrated in the way that it was and was internalized outside of Ukraine in a way that it was, again, in this sort of existential unity with Russia.
No, the victor's right to history, I guess, is
exactly
what I'm trying to say. I understand that. It's very unfortunate. And, talking from the United States, of course, it just seems very, very recently, and I'm talking in the last possibly 2 years, where some people at least, are becoming aware that there's another part of history, that what Russia says is not only is it not usually true, it's almost never true. And that we've been, supporting and actually spreading their misinterpretation, their propaganda about history. And hopefully it's slowly, or maybe hopefully not so slowly, changing. Most people in the West are totally unaware that of Ukrainian independence movements prior to the Orange Revolution in 2004 and the demonstrations and the violence that took place on the Maidan. Could you speak at least a little bit about some of the leading figures from the history of Ukrainian popular movements for independence and the time periods when they occurred? I know they're mostly relatively brief, but could you take us through that? Because again, most in the West think that Ukraine only tried to become independent in 1991.
I think that's Oksana again.
Yeah, that's what, okay. Without going sort of too deep in history, but first of all, I would say even the so-called reunification of Russia and Ukraine, how it is portrayed in the Russian historiography, the 17th century, when the leader of Ukrainian Cossacks, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, signs this agreement with the Tsar. It's actually interesting yet that many don't know that, for example, they needed an interpreter to understand each other, right? So if you are one nation at that point in time, right, they did not even speak a mutually comprehensible language. And also importantly, that the original of this document is actually missing. So all we have is a translation that that's kept in the Russian archives, and one can sort of wonder, falsification of history is not a recent thing. So what exactly they signed, and this is sort of the debate, did Bogdan Khmelnytsky sign a military union? Because at the time, with Ukrainian lands being in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, they were basically debating with the Polish crown the extent of the autonomy that they wanted. They wanted more autonomy than the Polish rulers were willing to provide. And sort of the Cossacks side with all these other powers at the time. They tried to side with the Crimean Tatars to the south. They periodically find agreement with the Poles that then break down. And then they also begin to look at to the Muscovy, as the Russian state was called at the time. And they signed this agreement, which again, from day one, essentially is disputed what's it all about. So Russia would tell you, and that's the story they've been telling, that, these little Russians wanted to reunite with Russia, and that was kind of the culmination of historical justice. And, historians of that period of Ukraine, they would say that Khmelnytsky basically was looking for kind of military alliance. And then he quickly regretted that he signed, because Russia, again, began to usurp more and more of the Cossacks' power. So the agreement was that they would give Cossacks certain autonomy. And then they began to renege on this promise. And then, there were splits in the Cossacks. There were all of these sort of complex, debates and switching sides and so forth. So that's sort of one example, right? Then, if we go another example, and this is actually also really interesting how it got portrayed historically, this figure known Mazepa. He was also a hetman in the early 18th century. And in Russia, he's portrayed as a traitor. He has been excommunicated by the Russian Orthodox Church because he sides with the Swedish king against Peter I in the wars at the time. And ultimately, Russian Empire defeats Peter, so Mazepa sort of loses, right? Was Mazepa a traitor? And of course, if you have an imperial lens, you can say, sure, he was a subject of the Tsar, he betrayed the Tsar, he's a traitor, end of story. But if you take sort of Ukrainian history lens, you say, again, here was the leader of Ukrainian Cossacks who believed that the Tsar was usurping more and more powers of the Cossacks. He reneged on the promise that was made when the treaty was signed, 60 or whatever years prior. And he was a hero of national liberation, right? So he sort of now becomes seen as quite different personality. And this is exactly what was happening in Ukraine after 91, when Ukrainians began to write their own history. Now there was a Ukrainian state. There was a debate about all of these things. Like, was Mazepa really a traitor, or was he potentially not, right? Like, did Khmelnytsky want to reunite with Russia, quote unquote, or did he sign a military treaty that the terms of which were later broken? And then if you go forward in time, of course, after Tsarist Empire collapses, in the early 20th century, by that point, there is already national movement. As you mentioned, David, this idea of nationalism is relatively recent. Sort of this notion that people belong to national communities really kicks in the 18th, 19th century. And in Ukraine at the time, sort of the territories of Ukraine that are partly in Austro-Hungarian Empire, partly in the Russian Empire, this idea is catching popular imagination. Not to say that everybody wasn't, united in believing this. There were urban-rural differences, religious differences, but there were a lot of people at the time who now believed that Ukraine should have its own state and be a separate republic. And then the Bolsheviks crushed this popular movement, right? So when Putin says that Lenin creates Ukraine out of nothing, it is completely wrong as a historical record, because Lenin actually engages in these policies of giving certain concessions to ethnic nationalities, including Ukrainians, in the Soviet Union, because they faced very strong Ukrainian nationalist mobilization in a few years prior, had to fight it, still feared it. And that was sort of the way that they decided they could kind of rein it in. So they could give this group certain cultural concessions, but political control would stay in Moscow. So Lenin was kind of reacting to the strength of Ukrainian nationalism and national identity, not creating it out of thin air. So these are just, some of the examples of the before 2004. And then, of course, there was mobilization for independence in late perestroika period, massive mobilization, again, with some important regional variations in late 80s, early 90s. And that's sort of where the story of our book picks up in greater detail. So we can talk about that as well.
even till this day, if I talk to some of my Russian, well, I'll still call them friends, they believe that either Lenin and or Khrushchev created Ukraine, that it's a gift, and that they can't understand why they're so, why they're all traitors, why they're fighting the Russians. They just can't understand it. But that's another story.
Well, maybe, you know, American-British comparison could be relevant here, right? Like the patriots who fought against the British Empire, were they, you know, the Brits who betrayed the king, right? Or were they American nation information that then developed its own interests and preferences, right? So that's sort of, yes, you were part of the same polity as, you know, in Russian Empire, Ukrainian and Russian territories were part of the same polity. But then, you know, there were different sort of historical, political, economic processes, this process of nation formation, right? And in that sense, maybe kind of pointing to the American, are they, you know, really British at heart, right? Did they, like, was it some kind of betrayal and fake preferences?
Well, sure. And that was, of course, a huge controversy at the time. Who was a Tory? Who was a patriot? Who was a traitor? And again, the victors write the story. So I want to jump ahead to something else that you wrote about, and there's just one of the most tragic incidents in the 20th century. Actually, the Ukrainian, and I'm probably mispronouncing it, the Holodomor, of course, the starvation, the mass, the famine, and forced starvation by Stalin. Again, most in the West don't even know this word exists, what it means, or what happened. Could you at least briefly describe that period in Russian-Ukrainian relations and exactly what happened? What was that tragic experience? You
have all these history questions. That was sort of more the work that I was doing in the book. So
I'm sorry, Maria.
Yeah. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I promise I'll get to other political reasons.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So basically, again, so as I said, when the Soviet Union is created in 1921, after the Bolsheviks win the Civil War, and they managed to subjugate, essentially win or crush, I should say, Ukrainian attempt to have a separate state. Then there is this period briefly in the 1920s of what's known as nativization policy, when Lenin leadership gives various concessions, cultural primarily, to these different ethnic republics, including Ukraine. So in Ukraine in the 1920s, there is sort of like a cultural renaissance. There is a lot of theater, art, so forth. But then development in Ukrainian. But then that's also sort of becomes, you know, the central state gets suspicious of this. It's like, you know, you're trying to control this process of kind of natural cultural expression, and then they begin to suspect, you know, communist parties getting too nationalistic and so forth. Now, add to it that they also had this agricultural policy of collectivizing the land, and they ran into a lot of peasant resistance, not only in Ukraine, but especially in Ukraine, given that, again, it was largely peasant society at the time. So then in the 1930s, in the early 30s, there is this combination of, you know, there was a bit lower harvest certain year, and then this completely unrealistic grain quotas that lead to resistance in the society, that peasants were not able to produce, to deliver that much grain. And then this resistance gets interpreted, and this is a really critical part that even Russian historians deny to this day, that it does get interpreted, resistance in Ukraine, as some sort of expression of nationalism that needs to be crushed. So then Stalin, starting from the fall of 1932, essentially increases grain quotas and introduces various punitive measures, such as taking anything of value from the peasants, anything that can be eaten or exchanged for food, closing the roads, creating so-called blacklists, essentially knowingly condemning people to death. So that becomes known in Ukraine as Holodomor. So famine takes place over several years, but really the peak of it, when most people die, is from late 1932 into summer of 1933. And then in the Soviet period, this was completely, basically, you can't talk about it. It was illegal to talk about it. My grandmother, for example, was an eyewitness to it. She was a tween, like she was 12. About half of population in her village died. And she just could not, you know, it was dangerous to talk about it. So she would, you know, we have this reverence towards food, but no kind of discussion about it in the Soviet period. And then, of course, with the start of perestroika, and ultimately when Ukraine becomes independent, there is a lot of research into this in Ukraine, because it is really intergenerational trauma. people, whose grandparents lived through this, who now can talk about it. There are all these eyewitness testimonies. And in Ukraine, the historians begin to question the reasons for the famine. In other words, were they the same across the whole of the Soviet Union, that Stalin tries to collectivize land, this process is resisted, and then everybody suffers equally? To this day, Putin defines it as a common tragedy, quote unquote, of the Soviet people. Or was there something specific in Ukraine? So in addition to these socioeconomic causes, was there also a national cause in Ukraine? Because Ukrainian society, Ukrainian leadership is perceived as being infected with nationalism, and famine is used as a punitive measure against, again, Stalin was fully aware that people were dying en masse. So the sort of intent in the definition of genocide, many historians say it was there because he knew what he was doing and he continued to do it, right? And this debate whether famine was or was not a genocide essentially, becomes important. And then in Ukrainian society, during Yushchenko presidency, law would be passed that would say famine was a genocide, and now nearly 80% of the population agrees with it. So Ukraine really moved to kind of interpreting and narrating and remembering this policy as a genocide of the Ukrainian people that was caused by the Soviet government. So imagine sort of what blow it does to this concept of unity, existential unity as the right thing, quote unquote, because at the time when Russia and Ukraine were in one state, the state was ruled by the essentially kind of Russian Communist Party and, the central government that was not Ukrainian, does the genocide to the Ukrainian nation, right? That's really detrimental to this idea that Ukraine rightfully belongs with Russia. And of course, in Russia, to this day, the official story is that, yes, there was famine, socioeconomic reasons, collectivization, everybody suffers equally, and any sort of, centering Ukrainian suffering in particular is some malignant Western propaganda and or some extreme nationalism. So that's sort of, again, sort of fundamental divergence in the interpretation of this historical event, right? And again, in Ukraine, as we're emphasizing in the book, we have quite a bit, section about it. It's a domestic political process. It's something that Ukrainian society grappled with, given personal memories. It's something the Ukrainian state grappled with, historians, and then they, have this kind of reconceptualization of what famine was. And Russia absolutely does not accept that. They consider it falsification of history. They created the whole commission to fight these sorts of reinterpretations. So that's where, again, we see fundamental divergence of remembering the common past, the shared past between these two countries.
I have a brief side story about this. When I was traveling and visiting in Kyiv and also Moldova several years ago, about 20 some years ago, I went to history museums in both cities, both countries. And there were letters that were preserved, written by mothers to Stalin at the time, begging him to send food because their children were starving to death. And I was traveling with some Ukrainians and some Russians and some Moldovans. And when the letters were translated and read, the Russians laughed. And I said, what could you possibly be laughing about, these letters, a mother begging to have food for her starving children? And they said, because this woman thinks that Stalin is going to take the time to read her letter. He's the president or secretary general. I can't tell you the rage that I felt, but it's the attitude. It's just the attitude. And if anything, that encapsulated the attitude of Russia to Ukraine and actually any of the, in quotes, vassal states.
Yeah, and that was just, just one sort of point to end on this was about the famine. It's just, we mentioned it in the book also as a piece of evidence to show how really Russia cared about these things to much greater extent than what Ukraine did geopolitically, any sort of hypothetical NATO memberships and all of this. In 2008, when Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov is asked, what are the two main problems in bilateral relations? What are the main problems in bilateral relations? He does not mention Ukraine's, at that point, Yushchenko advocated for NATO membership. He does not point, say, major economic conflict they had over or the transfer of gas pipelines through Ukraine. The main problems, as far as Russia was concerned in 2008, was history and language. The way Ukraine was changing, sort of re-narrating and questioning Soviet historical narratives was the main problem, and the fact that they emphasized development of Ukrainian language and kind of undoing the legacy of Russification. So it really goes, I think this notion that if only Ukraine, agreed to be neutral, then Russia would be fine with it. Like, we really push against that in the book, and I think a lot of evidence to say that their beef with Ukraine, their grievances about Ukraine go much, much deeper into all sorts of domestic politics, especially cultural and identity policy. Because again, it sort of serves to undo this narrative that by right, organically, God-given, they belong together. That's something that's been questioned in Ukraine.
I know I'm going to be compressing a lot of the history into a very short period of time, but in trying to get this all together as much as possible and cover as much of your book as possible, I wanted to talk about the period of time from the fall of the Soviet Union to Ukrainian independence, to the first Russian invasion in 2014. And you cover this, of course, in your book. What led up to that? What led up to Maidan, politically, culturally, and diplomatically, and all of that? Could it have been prevented? And why did Russia and Ukraine take such different roads during that period leading up to the Orange Revolution? And describe that any way you feel best, either one of you, and describe, if you could, what happened and why.
So initially, when the Soviet Union disbanded in its constituent republics, and Russia and Ukraine were now independent states, the early 90s see sort of what looked like parallel political development for both Russia and Ukraine. They were dealing with similar issues. The command economy of the communist period was collapsing. It gave way to enormous economic hardship for both the Russian population and the Ukrainian population, as the market was being built, but without the institutions in place to regulate it effectively. There was the rise of the oligarchs. There was hyperinflation. There was a massive demographic economic crisis in both countries. So we may tend to look at the two countries as being highly similar in that period. So two versions of more or less the same post-communist dysfunctional regime. But as we note in the book, as early as the mid-90s, we start seeing significant political differences between the two countries. One thing that we highlight is that in 93, 94, in that period, in both countries, politics kind of could be condensed into this this short story of competition between the president and a hostile parliament, and sort of an idea of how to manage this competition, where the president wanted to gain more power for the presidency, and parliament was asserting itself because it was controlled by different forces. And we start seeing in as early as 93, 94, the beginning of divergence between Russia and Ukraine, because the way that this tension is resolved in the two countries is actually quite different. What we have in Russia in 93 is President Yeltsin bombing parliament in order to impose his way. We see that the attempt to find some sort of compromise solution between competing ideas about how to write the independent state's new constitution, the negotiation between Yeltsin and parliament doesn't work. It ends up in this attempt by parliament to impeach Yeltsin and remove him, and him remaining in power by bombing parliament, closing down the constitutional court, putting his own constitution draft to a referendum, and calling new elections. So it's the moment at which the beginning of a democratic project in Russia really sputters significantly. I mean, it's a moment where Russian democracy sort of doesn't rise up to the challenge. In Ukraine, on the other hand, a similar type of competition between parliament and and the incumbent president there's a lot of similarities there, but we see eventually a compromise being hammered out. We see early elections for president, and we see the first Ukrainian president, Kravchuk, lose those elections. So it's from that very start that we see that there is some divergence already starting between in the type of political regimes that are going to develop. This divergence already starts in the 90s between Russia and Ukraine. And during the rest of the 90s, there is more. This is not to say that sort of Ukrainian democracy suddenly flourishes because the first president loses the election, but political competition is maintained in Ukraine. And there's, in a lot of ways, it's dirty competition. There's attempts at manipulating elections. There is attempts to censor the media. I mean, it's a messy kind of political competition in both countries in that time. But again, what we see in the Orange Revolution that eventually happens in Ukraine is we see a critical juncture in which ultimately Ukrainian democracy is strengthened. Why? Because basically during the Orange Revolution, we have mass social mobilization. We have a process going through the courts in which a compromise is hammered out between the competing political political elites, and a very strong precedent is set where basically the Ukrainian polity now has created a precedent that manipulated election results are not going to stand. The mass mobilization and the court together, and the compromise that's hammered out with constitutional reform between the Orange Coalition and Yanukovych, basically leads to a compromise solution which does not allow manipulated election results to stand. Whereas in Russia, we have gradual snuffing out of political competition. First, because Yeltsin manages to win re-election through massive aid by oligarchs, buying of votes. Basically, he goes from a really low approval rating when the campaign starts to eventually winning kind of improbably the election. So in Russia, we don't have a turnover in power. We have the same president who remains. First, he bombs parliament, then he wins sort of a questionable election. And then in 1999, he does this swap where Yeltsin has chosen the successor, Putin. By that time, he resigns early in order to pave the way for Putin's election. So basically, the 90s and leading up to the early 2000s is the story of some similarities, political similarities in the messiness of political competition in Russia and Ukraine, but Ukraine consistently making small steps towards institutionalizing democratic competition, turnovers in power, and the rejection of electoral manipulation by 2004.
Okay, thank you. That brings us more or less to 2014, through the full-scale invasion in February of 2022. In your book, you talk about the many ways, and you just summarize some of them now, in which Russia and Ukraine were diverging on a wide range of issues such as religion, economics, a deepening sense of Ukrainization among the people, decommunization laws, anti-corruption laws, a rejuvenated interest in the Ukrainian language, judicial reform, and Ukraine's leaning towards Europe, looking towards the West and the EU and NATO, and away from Russia. democratic reform and more. Again, you just talked about some of those changes right now, but why do you think, and especially after 2014 until 2022, and the full-scale invasion, why did that heat up so fast? I mean, you said they did, and I know they did. All of these issues in Ukraine took a totally different road. Do you know why? Was it just the Orange Revolution? Was it just the little green men and the seizure of Crimea and the Donbass, or what was percolating underneath all of that caused such a fast metamorphosis in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian psyche?
Yeah, in the book, I think we basically, if we simplify it a little bit, there are kind of two main reasons for this acceleration after 2014. One is actually, you can almost say simply mathematical, because once Putin moves to annex Crimea and then fosters this separatist insurgency in Donbass, about 12% of the Ukrainian electorate, and these are people who have been historically, and remained actually still in 2014, kind of quite Russia-friendly. Sort of, they would vote for pro-Russian parties, they're the ones who oftentimes, would see things sort of similar to how Russia saw them, say oppose some of these policies that pro-Western governments try to pursue. But they no longer vote in the elections, right? So Putin kind of shoots himself in the foot with this. And that really changes the electoral geography in Ukraine, because if before the elections produced, sort of the electorate was quite divided. We talk in the book how this divide was actually more complicated. There were processes, kind of the pro-Western half, quote unquote, was increasing gradually over time. But still in 2014, there is a substantial kind of Russia-friendly constituency in Ukraine. But a lot of them now cannot vote in the elections because Putin did what he did, right? So that really changes what kind of parties get elected to parliament. So now, for example, communists are completely wiped out, the pro-Russian parties become much smaller, and this kind of pro-Western political camp becomes bigger. And additionally, the second reason is that this Russian aggressive action in 2014 really turns a lot of Ukrainians away from Russia. So even people who were sort of Russia-friendly, who spoke Russian, as their primary language, who may have voted for some sort of Russia-leaning parties before, this kind of outright assault on Ukrainian statehood, on Ukrainian sovereignty is rejected by these people. And then we begin to see the embrace of these, say, even identity issues. We see on all of these measures, strengthening of Ukrainian identity, people who primarily identify as Ukrainian citizens. That goes up after 2014 substantially. Attitudes to history, right? Be it Holodomor, be it other questions where Ukraine really has a different interpretation of these historical events in Russia. We see greater support for that. We see reduced support for, personalities that, in Russian historical narrative are seen as positive, like Stalin and Lenin. Support for them is down, right? So this divergence really grows, in Ukraine in particular. I mean, Maria can tell that it's kind of divergence on the Russian story, maybe during the same time period. But in Ukraine, we would say that these two factors, the sort of mathematical change in geography and loss of the most pro-Russian electorate, as a factor in the Ukrainian elections, and secondly, change in attitudes in the remaining part of Ukrainian society as a rejection of this Russian aggression of 2014. So really, Putin kind of trying to hold Ukraine in and complaining that it is anti-Russian really makes it more anti-Russian than it was before, which is quite ironic.
Maybe I'll add here also that once Russia escalates to aggression, it becomes clearer to a bigger proportion of the Ukrainian electorate that an orientation towards Europe is really Ukraine's best chance of preserving its independence. So we see that after Euromaidan, the association agreement with the EU that was kind of the trigger for Euromaidan, Yanukovych reneging on signing this was the trigger for Euromaidan. After Euromaidan is over and victorious, that association agreement is eventually signed, and that agreement puts in a lot of these reforms that Ukraine is committed now to passing in order to move towards EU membership. And it's something that becomes there's more realization both among Ukrainian elites and among the electorate that the way to preserve independent statehood is related to these reforms that are going to make the country viable as an EU candidate and move it in this pro-European, pro-Western direction.
Let me say that one of the reasons that Putin said that he initially invaded and seized eastern Ukraine, the Donbass and Crimea, was because Russian speakers were being slaughtered, were being intimidated, and even Russian children were being crucified, all kinds of horrible things. Most of my visits to Ukraine over the years were in central, southern, and eastern Ukraine, from Kyiv to Odessa to Kharkov to Kherson, Odessa. And I met very few people who spoke Ukrainian, to be very honest with you. Everyone spoke Russian. And I wasn't aware of anyone who felt persecuted at all. And I never met a Nazi, to be honest with you. So, you know, that's nonsense. Everybody knows it's nonsense, but I have some very personal experience with that over the years. So I just thought I'd like to interject that. Finally, we come to the period post the or after the 2022 invasion. It seems that all of the cultural and political processes and changes that were happening in the period between the Euromaidan and the total war, the total escalation and invasion, accelerated again tremendously, of course, after February of 2022. Patriotism, abandoning the Russian language, even in the East, Ukrainians identifying as Ukrainians and supporting their nation and joining the EU and NATO just exploded. And you, of course, deal with this in the last part of your book. Could you bring us current with that quickly changing Ukrainian landscape from the full-scale invasion in February of 2022 to today?
Yeah, maybe I'll start by pointing out that it is somewhat of a cliche at this point when people say Ukrainians are fighting for democracy. I think a lot of people don't realize what that actually means, and they probably don't realize that this is absolutely not a cliche, but an actual fact, because what we've seen during the last few years, accelerated even more after the full-scale invasion, is near total commitment by the Ukrainian electorate to the idea that they would like Ukraine to be a well-functioning democratic state. It's not simply about choosing the West, because what you'll see some people say are things like, well, they're just changing from a Russian vassal to a Western vassal. They're just changing the master. But there is absolutely a lot more to this idea of being integrated into the West, and it is specifically this commitment to building a democratic state, which is one of the effects of Russia's aggression, basically. The Russian aggression has really brought home to people in Ukraine that there is enormous value in democracy and freedom of the press, freedom of conscience, freedom to express, freedom to criticize the authorities as much as you want. For example, I don't know if your viewers have seen this video of this woman in Kherson who, when the Russian tanks are rolling in, she says, "Let us deal with our own government ourselves. We're going to take care of whatever we want to take care. We don't need you." So it is this recognition that freedom of political competition is something that would immediately disappear if Russia were to occupy Ukraine, and it is something that the Ukrainian electorate highly values.
Yeah, I'll just add to it. I think the story of the divergence that we tell in the book, that, we trace it to the late Soviet period and how it unfolded over the next 30 years, we could say that after the February 22 full-scale invasion, this divergence sort of like in hyperdrive, right? So not only in Ukraine, there is this, as Maria just describing and as you were mentioning, really growing commitment. It's like 80+% support, for democracy, for European Union, for NATO membership, all of these things, right? And then, but in Russia, it's the opposite. I mean, the regime it was already authoritarian when Russia invaded, but it becomes even more so. It sort of turns to this kind of grotesque authoritarian personalistic dictatorship, and a full throat, not just denial, of Ukrainian existence, but, calls for genocide. Basically, whoever cannot be re-educated needs to be killed. We're hearing this from Medvedev, who we can say, well, he drinks too much, but he also has a senior position in the Russian government, right? Putin continues sort of to narrate this historical past in a way that, there has no room for independent free Ukraine. So that's sort of the bridging. So the divergence accelerates yet more after 2022. And I think it also has implications for potential way that the conflict, the war could end and can't end. I mean, this notion that, if only Ukraine gave Putin like piece of its territory, then everything can be fine. I mean, we hear these calls for kind of land for peace settlement. I mean, we would say the lessons from our book and from the last 2 years that this is just a delusion. Like, it's not going to work because Putin is not willing to accept independent, sovereign Ukraine, even in reduced borders. And, he makes it clear time and again that they have issue not just with Ukrainian geopolitical orientation. They want to control what it can do in all sorts of matters of domestic politics, in history, in local government reform, in media, anti-corruption, oligarchs, you name it. They want to control everything, and they can't because society would not accept it. So it would have to be, right, full-scale occupation with military force to, subjugate Ukraine, and they can do that. And if, say, somehow some sort of agreement was reached where some part of Ukraine is allowed to exist but does not have any security guarantees, NATO membership, it's just a matter of time before Putin would find whatever the government there does is too nationalistic, and we would have yet another invasion. And Ukrainians very well understand that. That's why there is no societal support. It's not that sort of society wants it and Zelensky doesn't. Like, there is no societal support for this kind of territorial settlement because people understand very well what's it all about.
For me personally, one of the most tragic and depressing issues with this whole depressing time is the fact that many, if not most, Russian people, especially those over 40 or 50 years of age, when interviewed, and I don't believe any of the surveys, but when interviewed and during personal conversations, as you just said, they fully support the invasion. They not only support the invasion, they support some of the most grotesque actions in the invasion, such as the murders and the rapes and the wanton destruction and bombing of hospitals and kidnapping of children. I mean, to me, it's still hard to understand, but I do understand it. I do accept it. And to me, again, that's one of the most depressing things. This will take generations to get over. This is not something that's going to be solved even when Ukraine wins the war, whether that's next year or 5 years from now, because that's a cultural defect. That's a deep, deep-seated cancer. And I just had to say that. In the last section of your book, you actually, to follow up on that, you ask a question. Russia, genocidal dictatorship. Well, I just answered that question. I think, yes, it definitely is a genocidal dictatorship. But please talk about why you wrote that and what are your thoughts in answers to your own question?
I think we wrote this because as the full-scale invasion started in 2022, there was a lot of talk by Russia about sort of achieving its goals, but not as much genocidal rhetoric right from the get-go. Partly, as Oksana mentioned earlier, because they probably expected to be able to establish control quite quickly, put in a puppet of some sort, and govern that way. But as they failed and as they realized the extent of resistance that they would be facing, I think things have escalated in Russia during the last 2.5 years. And escalated towards more and more embracing not just, some propagandists on TV are maybe, going too far. No, I think there's increasing realization that for them to establish control, they would have to kill substantial numbers of Ukrainians and those who identify with the Ukrainian conception of their nationhood and statehood, which really now starts meeting the genocide definition.
I would just add, so also, like Bill, David, what you were saying, that this sort of Russian kind of, the lens that through which they view Ukraine, and many of them are indeed cheering for this horrendous acts that the Russian army has committed in Ukraine. We maybe have, not really optimistic necessarily, but maybe less deterministic view of sort of what may happen in Russia. Because I don't think our story is about some sort of genetic Russian imperialism, for lack of a better word. It's really more that, yes, there is obviously the strong history, but it's contingent. It is, for example, there were different conceptions of the Russian nation out in circulation in the first half of the 1990s. And hypothetically, I mean, we go into the book why it didn't happen, a more sort of, non-imperial conception could have taken root. It didn't, but it could have. So in that sense, if, say, one day, Putin goes and there is some, point again of transition in Russia, hypothetically speaking, we're not saying that this is likely to happen, and probably as of today, there are more reasons to think that it won't happen than it will, but hypothetically at least, right? Again, the Russian political class and the Russian public could decide to wrestle with their historical past, could decide to question their imperialism, could decide to question their views of Ukraine, could again pick things from Russia's own history that are more conducive to, say, democratic and non-imperial development. There was actually an attempt shortly in the 1990s to kind of center the history of the Novgorod Republic, which was sort of more democratic form of rule than this centralized tsars of the Muscovy. That goes by the wayside. But again, if there was a commitment, we are not saying that it necessarily will be. And if ask us to predict today, as you, we don't really see signs of it happening. But again, hypothetically, Russian society could question its imperial past. It could question its imperial lens. Could look for sort of things in the Russian old history when there were these tendencies before that they were suppressed and then forgotten and so forth. Will we see it happen? We don't know. But again, at least if you wanted to add on somewhat hypothetical and more positive note, we wouldn't exclude this outright as a possibility.
Oh, absolutely. And
that's why it's important. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Maria, go ahead.
I was going to say that's why it's important for Russia to lose this war, because it's much more likely that such a turn in Russia would happen under conditions of where it's clearly demonstrated to the Russian population that the imperial conquest is not a useful, doesn't bring anything good to Russia. It brings defeat. Then there's much more likely for there to be sort of a turn to, let's think about how we can be Russia without imperialist expansion.
I'll just add on to that. Unless Russia is decisively defeated, I mean, they don't get to keep the Donbass. They don't get to, dictate whether or not Ukraine joins NATO or the EU, whether they don't suffer catastrophic losses with their military, and if their economy is just not shattered. I agree with you. This is not going to change. This is just not going to change. And I want it to change. I don't want a pariah Russia. Don't get the wrong idea. But just the way it's gone, especially in the last 2 years, and speaking with many Russians and listening to interviews where many Russians could just say no comment, or I agree with the government or something. They actually add some disgusting, violent thoughts about what they think should be done to Ukraine. That's not propaganda. That's their own gut. They don't have to say anything, but they do. And it's not just a few, it's a lot. So that's why I say this is a generational change. It's going to, in my opinion, going to take at least one generation, and only, as you said, Maria, if Russia loses. That's why it's so important for the West to stay united and not to send arms, dribs and drabs, and financial support just a little bit for Ukraine to survive another bloody day. They need to win. They need to win, and they need to win soon. Look, we need to wrap this up. I know. Any final thoughts about the history of Russia and Ukraine, and obviously where they are now and where we go from here? Just final thoughts on that.
We
I
covered
guess
so
my
much.
final thought
Mhm.
would be to emphasize that the divergence has gone so far that I think we in the West have to be really clear-eyed that there will not be some sort of solution, some sort of compromise where Ukraine is left in Russia's sphere of influence and they patch things up. We really need to let go of that delusion.
Yeah, I have very similar thought, maybe just sort of a different way of putting it. I think, viewers and people in the West who watch this war unfold, I think appreciating Ukrainian agency is very important, because I think this great power politics lens, and that goes not just for Ukraine, but for smaller powers, because whichever event you look at, this whole notion that there are these sort of great powers and they can kind of manipulate the smaller countries that have no say, is just inaccurate. I mean, even if you look at NATO expansion, it wasn't like US or NATO luring these East European countries. They were begging to get in exactly because they feared, renewed Russian imperialism. And in Ukraine now, this notion that people can be forced into accept some sort of settlement, like there is no democratic process in Ukraine that could return to power some kind of pro-Russian puppet. There just isn't. And then sort of think about it, like, what does it really mean, right? Like, it's proxy war. Like, in what sense is a proxy war when people want to be free and they fight, right? And they don't want to be subjugated. So I think, then to what Maria says, I think it's easier to kind of see that if you really give agency to these quote unquote smaller nations, which in the 21st century we really need to.
Maria Popova, Oxana, Shevel, thank you both for joining us on the No Delusion Zone. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you.
You.
Okay. I will stop the recording soon. Thank you. It was a great discussion. I enjoyed having you both very much.
Thank you for great questions. We could have gone on probably another hour.
We could have gone on a very long
exactly.
time. No, I said this and I meant it. I have had to condense a lot of the book and a lot of history into a 1 hour, because we could have gone for 2 or 3 hours. But again, I thank you both very much. I enjoyed the book. Again, it was the best of the current books on Ukraine and Russia. I am going to post a link and a copy of the book on my website and on the podcast, and hopefully a lot more people will get to read it.
Thanks very much.
Excellent.
If you don't mind, you can
Thank
leave us a review on Amazon. Somebody gave us 1 star yesterday without any comment. They're like, okay, if you do this, at least say why, right?
No doubt a Russian troll, but I will do so.
Yes, probably.
I will do so. Both of you, take care. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, David. Really a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank
You
you.
bet. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.